We now move straight into item 8. That's a presentation from Auckland Transport on their budget update, and we have with us Daniel Yu, Pramod from Council, and of course also present is Mark Lang. Who would like to lead off?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kia ora, good morning, everyone. It's Pramod here. So through you, Chair, I'll do a brief introduction for this item and then happy to answer any questions. And as you've mentioned, Mark from Auckland Transport is also on the call to respond to any questions if required. So the purpose of this report is for the committee to consider a request from the Board of Auckland Transport for additional operational funding this financial year. Councils have been advised at previous meetings and workshops that COVID-19 has impacted AT's revenue from public transport, as well as parking and enforcement. At this stage, it's difficult to say what the full year impact will be, but estimates based on the first quarter results, taking account of the projected lost revenue, projected reduction in operating spend of around 26 million, and the assumption of 51% of Waka Kotahi top-up, a 50 million operating deficit is projected. To comply with their duty of care, the Board of Auckland Transport seek confirmation from Auckland Council of ongoing operational financial support. Also noted in this paper is that Auckland Transport are anticipating an under delivery of their capital program, which could result in around 50 million of reduced payments this year. So from a cash flow perspective, the estimated reduced cash inflow from operating revenues might be broadly offset by the reduced capital outlay over this period. And so this will mitigate any debt pressure for the council this financial year. So staff, in terms of recommendations, staff do recommend the additional funding be approved and also request that Auckland Transport continue to work with central government to secure additional funding and financial support for the lost fare revenue this year, as well as minimising their costs and maximising revenue where opportunities arise. So that's the summary, Madam Chair. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Pramod. I mean, although the resolutions are written in the order that they are, in some respects, A should be C, shouldn't we? So shouldn't it? So we would request Auckland Transport continue to make all reasonable efforts to secure central government funding, then continue to pursue their own opportunities, and then finally look at council as the additional operating funder as a last resort. Would that be correct? I mean, basically what I'm asking you is, surely Auckland Transport would look elsewhere first if they can prioritise that.
Yes, so and Mark might want to add something. So Auckland Transport are already making all efforts to explore those avenues and are working with central government. I suppose at this stage, year to date, there are operational deficits. The estimate of 50 million is for the full year. So we are having to continually, so we are already providing additional operational funding to Auckland Transport, and it's important to approve that funding given half-year accounts will soon be prepared and audit requirements need to be met as well.
I can just, Maureen and everyone, I can just add a few comments if you like. So I totally support the if you wanted to reorder the recommendation. In terms of C, the piece about central government B, every week we hear pretty much that it's going to get considered, and then every week it's getting kicked, the can's getting kicked down the road. So I'm not too honest that we were told there was going to be an update this week. We're not holding our breath as to when that occurs, and the sort of noises we hear is that it may not be 100% top up, it may be, for example, 75%. And I think through the lights of the mayor, I think he's pushed absolutely as hard as he can. Probably shouldn't push any harder. But so B, we're absolutely pursuing those avenues. In terms of C, rest assured we're absolutely looking at every opportunity. And A, and this is where it sort of comes home to roost, A, even if we pulled every lever we've got at our disposal, we can't plug a hole that big within, this time period. And I guess if I just framed it up slightly differently, we sort of break our years down into these artificial constructs called financial years. If you take last financial year, we assumed that, we had some reasonably conservative assumptions in the budget around COVID. We actually ended up reporting $100 million surplus. this year we assumed that we would essentially be in alert level 1 all year, so we're suddenly going to probably report a 50 mil loss. If you add the 2 years together, we're saying actually we're going to still make a 50 mil surplus. It's just because of the volatility caused by COVID, the phasing of when the cash is landing is sort of quite volatile. So I guess wanted to flag that point. I mean, we're trying to run the business absolutely efficiently as we can. It's just that we've never seen anything like COVID causing the sort of level of volatility in earnings before.
Thanks for that, Mark. Okay, I've got 3 patai so far on my list: Councillor Coombe, Fletcher and Walker. I will start with Councillor Coombe.
O tēnā koe, Madam Chair. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. And thank you, Pramod and Mark, for joining us this morning for this item. I have my questions are related to parking revenue, and it's kind of in 3 parts, if I may, Madam Chair. The first part is at the Planning Committee on the 5th of November, when we talked about the parking strategy. The information provided from Auckland Transport gave the impression that we're only making, well, the income from parking is only 14 million, and it wasn't clear whether that was net or gross. And the question was asked of Auckland Transport, why is Wellington City Council appears to be making twice as much revenue from their parking assets, and presumably they have far fewer assets than Auckland Transport. And I just wondered if any further information has been able to be unearthed on this issue, because I have had multiple undertakings that I am going to get this information, but I think it's really relevant to this item when we're looking at Auckland Transport's revenue overall.
Happy to take that one now if you want to break them into chunks, if that's okay. Firstly, apologies, Councillor Coombe. There is a draft response sitting ready to come back to you on this. We were just bundling it with the other questions, and the team that's been working on it has been very heavily tied up with the targeted rate work, so there has been a delay on our side. Just to answer your question, though, we have gone and talked to Wellington Council. They earned $30 million per annum from parking and enforcement, and that was pre-COVID. Our budget for this year is 108 million for parking and enforcement. So it's more than 3 times as much at a headline level. But what you do need to do with our number is then pull out the SVL revenue, which is quite significant. So you get back to a number of around 70 million of revenue on a like-for-like basis compared to 30 odd for Wellington. In terms of, and that's for, I guess, excluding SVLs. Rest assured, so just another point I'd flag, we've actually got quite aggressive assumptions around parking and enforcement revenues in our budget. Our budget this year actually still assumed higher parking and enforcement revenues than pre-COVID. And part of the logic for that is every time we see a lockdown, we're seeing congestion back to 80% of pre-COVID levels already. So typically people are reverting back to private motor vehicles quicker. So we've got quite aggressive assumptions in there. And, we are, we're going to absolutely look to maximise that revenue to the extent we can coming through the rest of this year and into next. As because I guess there's 2 conversations here. What are we doing at the moment versus what are we planning to do for the budget for the year starting 1 July? But we've got a lot more detailed breakdown we'll send you, which looks at the actual direct and indirect costs around parking.
Thank you. I'm sure that will be of interest to all members, and particularly the chair of the committee. The second part of this goes to Auckland Transport's actions that appear to be counterproductive for encouraging PT uptake again. And this is, I'm really focusing on what's happening in the city centre, is because enforcement didn't happen under level 3 or was slow to happen, we've seen a massive uptake in drivers using our shared spaces as free parking, which is then not meaning we're not getting the revenue in our parking buildings, and it's encouraging more driving into the city centre because there's the impression that it's just a free-for-all in parking. And I appreciate all the volatility, use that word in a different context, but Todd Niall picked up on that too about people's behaviour, and I appreciate that with parking wardens, but being attacked, which is not good at all. But what assessment is Auckland Transport doing of the need to get on top of this issue to start enforcing effectively to actually encourage drivers or encourage visitors back into PT and to get drivers who want to drive into the city centre into the parking buildings where there's plenty of capacity. And so I'm just very concerned about these kind of counterproductive actions of Auckland Transport at the moment that are having a hit on our PT revenue enforcement and our parking, off-street parking revenue.
Just my apologies, Pippa, it's Councillor Sayers here. I just wanted to let the Chair know I've been able to dial in on my phone, so I'm in attendance.
Kia ora, Councillor Sayers.
Good.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks, Pippa.
Proceed.
But obviously, as we've been in lockdown, there's obviously a lot of trade-off conversations there around, safety of parking officers, as you point out, etc. I guess if I give you, the short version of rest assured, as soon as we get, as we come out of the period that we've been in, we absolutely want to, and we're totally cognizant that we get this reversion to car usage before public transport uptake, that we do, and parking plays a key role in that. And the internal team have got some quite aggressive targets around revenue targets for the remainder of the year. So we know we need to take, we're totally aware of the issues you're talking about.
Oh, that's good to know. And also, I imagine increasing the number of parking officers, if that's correct from Todd Niles' report, that your numbers have decreased at a time that they're needed more than ever. Yeah,
and I guess it's the classic thing of how many people we tend to bring them in tranches, but like the transport officers right. is, I guess we're almost thinking of the business in two phases at the moment. There's going to be this sort of shutdown period over Christmas, but really what plays out on the network as we get back into February, March, that's the key. How do we get users back on PT? We typically employ a tranche of those types of employees around late Jan, early Feb.
Thank you. And if I may, Madam Chair, just round it out with a final partai that goes to the recommendation of C and maximising revenue opportunities. In the report, for example, paragraph 14, paragraph 31, I think it's paragraph 20 as well, it talks about what AT is doing to minimise costs, but I don't find any reference to maximising revenue. For example, it says AT is working hard to minimise costs, but not working hard to maximise revenue. So it's reflected in the recommendation, but could you just speak to what is AT doing to maximise revenue, particularly, I think you've already talked to that around parking, but can you just give us some reassurance that this is a complete package, it's not just one part of it? Because I do think that's a very good request that we're making, but it's just not reflected in the report.
Absolutely. I guess the word maximise we've got to be slightly careful with too, because if you genuinely wanted to maximise, we'd put through a 15% increase in public transport fares, and so I'd probably use the language optimise. But how do we? So there's the volume versus price conversation. We have a whole plan set around how do we do the return to PT, as we've talked about in the past, and Vinnie Alice is leading that piece of work with Mark Lambert. We know that there's going to be ongoing issues with Kia Rail, with cracks and tracks and rail usage. So the return to PT, that is our big revenue lever, and then followed shortly thereafter by parking and enforcement. Within enforcement, the piece that where we've actually pick up the most revenue is around these special vehicle lanes. And then if I kind of give you a sense behind the scenes, Shane's lobbying hard in central government to how could we increase, for example, the cost of parking charges that we know that for years have been set at really low levels. So we're absolutely looking at every opportunity around what's required for the behavioural shift piece. But I guess I just want to dampen that with slightly, that doesn't mean we're just going to put through a massive fare increase. If people read that into the resolution.
No, I hope not.
And I'll just, sorry, one other one I know that you've raised before. So if I give you an example, so the charging for parking rides, if you remember in the 2020-21 budget, there was a 2.5% and a 3.5% rates rise consideration. And it was essentially if people voted for 3.5%, there would be no charging for parking rides. If it was 2.5%, then it would be done. given what the water that's gone under the bridge, I think we need to revisit that one. And I think, I was talking to the team about it in the last week, that I think that is one we do need to go and trial in a couple of sites and see what the impact it does have on public transport usage and whether it's, positive or negative. So we are looking at all those types of opportunities.
Kia ora, Mark. I really appreciate those responses. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and I do too, Mark. And to that end, I'm happy to move this, and I don't know whether the Deputy Mayor or Councillor Darby, as the transport people, want to second it. But thanks, Bill. I would be happy to change maximise to optimise. You okay with that, Pramod?
Sorry, just wanted the mute button. Yes, fine with that.
Right. Thank you. Right, Councillor Fletcher, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to Mark and Pramod, thank you for being before us today. And I have every sympathy for the difficulties you find yourself with COVID. Nobody could have anticipated this. I have a question, however, from that I will read to you by way of text from a constituent, and I undertook that I would do so. And that is in the request for an additional funding of operational funds of up to 50 million. I won't read you the whole thing. He said, you may be interested to know that Perry Road, this is Gary Bryant, a constituent from Albert Eden, Puketapapa. You may be interested to know that Perry Road is undergoing a revamp, new guttering and driveways being replaced at a cost of $880,000. The gutters and driveways were in fine and good condition. AT could give no valid reasons to me why the upgrade was needed. There are many more streets in Auckland that are worthy of upgrading than Perry Road. And then he says, so on Thursday, ask AT what if they hadn't done the unnecessary work in Perry Road, they would only need 49 million. Now, I'm sorry to bring it down to something very specific of that kind, but I would like to feel and have the comfort of knowing that in the prioritisation of a lot of that operational expense that we are really being very careful and prudent. So could you give me that assurance, please?
Yes, I can, Councillor, and I guess we can have a look at Perry Road and come back to you on that. I'm guessing it's CapEx renewals, and I'm sorry, I'm not meant to sound pedantic, versus operational maintenance, but and we can have a specific look at that one for you. But yes, we are absolutely being as prudent as possible, and I guess the litmus test for me is when I look at the pressure the organisation is under and staff and the types of requests we get coming through. There is a lot of tension within the organisation, as I'm sure that Jim would relay from how Auckland Council looks and feels at the moment.
Thank you for that answer, Mark. And I would like it if you could come back specifically on the Perry Road one. Gary Bryant is an accountant who follows council's finances very, very closely, and I'm sure he would appreciate a response, seeing as that he asked me specifically to raise it.
And just for clarity, that's Perry Road off Dominion Road?
Perry Road runs from Mount Eden Road through to Dominion Road, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker, you're next, and you are on the correct order. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. My first question goes to C. That is around continuing to pursue opportunities to minimise costs and optimise revenue opportunities. And my question is around what immediate work, and by that I mean right now, is occurring in the tactical marketing space to make better use of the sunk or fixed cost we have in the network and to increase revenue opportunities by getting more people onto buses, trains, and ferries in particular. The reason I ask this is we're certainly familiar with a tactical campaign that occurred in Millwater. We've had reports to us around that, around measures such as trip diaries. So my question is around what tactical marketing is occurring, and I'm not talking about bland marketing, that is just the usual business as usual marketing. I'm talking about finely honed marketing where there is plenty of capacity on particular routes and there is ample opportunity to get a positive response from people in terms of take-up that can significantly enhance our revenue, given that our costs around buses and trains and the like are relatively fixed. So my question coming back to it is, what is occurring right now, and can we have some oversight over that? Because there is an immediate requirement there. So just a fairly easy question, Mark. Thank you.
We have had Vanessa present, I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember which sessions it was, our Return to PT program. I almost wonder if we had a session or a workshop to take you through some of those materials as it pertains to, I guess, the return through February, March type timeframe, because obviously what happens over the next couple of months is very quiet on the network. But it's that whole return post-Christmas. So happy to take that one offline if we've got a wealth of material that we can take you through.
Through you, Madam Chair,
Yes.
I'm not talking about a return to PT campaign. I'm talking about tactical marketing that focuses specifically.
We can deal with Auckland Transport more with a full team in a CCO meeting. But thank you for that. Councillor Stewart. Councillor Stewart, we had a question from you.
I'm there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Are you aware of all the ghost buses that are travelling around out east at the moment? And why I'm saying that, wouldn't it be sensible to reduce some of the bus services when we know that there's so many buses that are empty? I can every day I could stand for hours and see nobody on the buses. So what's your suggestion there?
That's a really, really good question. And so if I answer it from two lenses, one is we're acutely aware of the ghost buses. If I give you, I guess, two ways we're thinking about it. One is Mark Lambert's talked about recasting the network. What that essentially means, and this is probably starting to link more to next year's budget, but we were forecasting to put on a new tranche of buses later towards this financial year and also into next. What we're thinking at the moment is we won't necessarily add all of those new buses to the network. We'll start shifting buses around across different routes to, I guess, effectively not have to add as many new ones because we know there's the significant surplus capacity, right? The other piece that links to that is we're looking at the fare strategy and how do we create more off-peak, on-peak sort of differentiation. So do you charge more for peak versus off-peak? How do we start shifting? Because all the cost gets driven by that peak vehicle requirement at rush hour. So that's the second bit. The third bit I'd just say, and this is the really interesting piece that's, I guess, hot off the press, Jane was just sharing with the AT board, which is on today's, our on-demand trial in the south. The on-demand services we've just put on are actually now carrying more passengers than the previous bus routes, the buses that were running those services for a fraction of the cost. So I guess if you add those three bits together, we see, as we're thinking about next year's budget, that we don't need to potentially add as many services. Sorry, as many physical buses, I should say, but you optimise the number of buses we've got more by having less running at peak, getting better coverage across the city, plus looking at more opportunity to potentially bring in on demand.
Thank you. And thanks, Councillor. I think we've all had comments around that in our ward. Councillor Casey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mark, I have a wonderful idea for you to optimise revenue. It's coming up to Christmas. We've got summer coming. There are 106,000 registered dogs in Auckland whose humans would love to take the bus. Now, why don't you give us all a great Christmas present? I've only got 10 months left of my term of office. It's been 3.5 years since Auckland Council unanimously asked Auckland Transport to allow access for pets. So what do you think?
I might slightly avoid. I'm the finance guy. I think financially it probably has merit, but I think that is one I could take back and have a chat with our team internally. I know this one's been raised a number of times in the past.
There's
What a
challenge.
good answer.
Thank
That
you.
was a very positive response. You hear that, Madam Chair? Thanks, Mark.
I did. Thank you. Right, I've got no further questions, but I'll move now to comments. And my first comment is from Councillor Coombe.
Oh, thanks, Madam Chair, but I don't want to jump ahead of Angela.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Councillor Dalton.
Apologies.
It's okay, Pippa can go.
No, sorry, my fault. Councillor Dalton, birthday girl goes first. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks, Pippa. Thanks, Leslie. Hey, I just really just in terms of the finances, I attended the AT board meeting this morning for an hour, and it was really clear to me, well, a couple of things actually. Just picking up on what Councillor Walker was talking about around marketing and comms, board was really clear about how the messaging needs to change to be around behaviour change and mode change, and really invested in that. And that's what they will be focusing on. And I do remember, I know this wasn't about return to PT, but I do remember that workshop where we talked about the campaign for return to PT, but their focus is on behaviour change. So I listened to the Chair's report, the CEO's report, and the speed reduction bylaw. Really important work, and a lot of investment in that as well, about keeping our streets safe. So in the first tranche, they had 8,000 submissions. They're expecting probably double that. That's a huge amount of work, which obviously costs money to do, but just making the point that there is a lot of money going into some outcomes that we have asked for. And I would support the recommendation here that we continue our financial support to ensure that those good bits of work can go through and progress. But I think my point was, we sit in these meetings and then we get criticised quite a lot about what we don't do, with no thought to how much time that we do put into the discussions that we have. And I just reflected on that as I was listening to the AT board and to the CEO and others, that when you're there listening to the output, there's a significant amount of work going on to try and achieve Auckland Council's direction given to AT. So thank you, Mark. I support your request for $50 million from somewhere. Thank you.
Up to, Councillor, up to.
Yes, Chair.
Thank you. And now, look, overnight I decided to do a bit of a technology upgrade with some equipment in my home, which was clearly a fail. But in doing so, my comments bar doesn't scroll down. So the Deputy Chair, how could I miss one of the most important members of this committee for a question? So I will return back to you, Councillor Henderson, for your question.
Thank you, Chair. Now you've hyped up this question. I hope it's a good one. Yeah, so I've received some inquiries around reduced Auckland Transport bus routes in December and January. So I just wanted to kind of just check, is this for financial reasons, or is there more more of an operational decision?
Principally financial.
Trying to save some money over summer?
Well, we've obviously, if you come back to the ghost bus comment, and obviously we've had targets, so we've got to save money in every part of the business. Is how do we optimize the use of the buses we've got? And part of what we've been doing is reducing frequency on certain key routes, because there's just the number of ghost buses that are travelling.
Okay, that's cool. And just a quick comment while I've got the floor. As a very recent dog owner, I reckon Councillor Casey's really onto something there. I just put my support behind that too. Thanks, Chair.
Indeed, me too. Okay, thank you for that, and apologies. And now we'll go back to Councillor Coombe. Thanks, Councillor, for your patience.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I do feel like I'm slacking hearing about birthday girl Councillor Dalton going to the AT board meeting this morning. Suddenly like, oh, is that somewhere I should have been? But I do, in speaking in support of this, I do particularly want to focus on the optimising revenue, and I'm going to make sure that I make this a financial commentary, because there's a number of points I just want to make about what's happening in the city centre. And Councillor Walker, you continue to refer to the city centre as a CBD. We don't have a CBD anymore. It's a city centre that has 40,000 residents living in it, and it's a really important distinction. And in terms of, it was really good that we've had both our finance people here, Pramod and Mark, because I've really appreciated their very clear responses to the questions about what we can be doing better to be optimising the revenue. And at the moment, we have got parking buildings that have got masses of capacity, and there might be a separate discussion about how we can be doing more campaigns to encourage use of those. But we've also got this really big issue that in the city centre, because enforcement didn't get underway as soon as level 3 started for whatever operational decision, probably to be nice to people, but it's had this counterproductive impact in that there's now this attitude that you can just park everywhere, and it's a massive issue all across our shared spaces, up on curves, damaging our beautiful new spaces. And it really does upset me when I hear councillors talk about how terrible the city centre is when it's looking really amazing. It's had a big scrub up over lockdown. People want to come in and see the lights. It has been a massive struggle for businesses in the city centre. I think I heard that it was $1 billion hit that they've taken. So this is the time that we've got to really put a comprehensive approach in place that will get people using the parking buildings that we've got, so we maximise our revenue there, get the drivers out of our shared spaces, get the income from enforcement, which is never revenue raising. It's about making places safer and more attractive to be, because the more we let this get out of hand, we're going to have all of this negative impact on the city centre, on visitors, on the residents that live there, and this impact on revenue that we're hearing about. And I do think we need to really do a deeper dive into how we're maximising our assets, our return on our assets. And it's great to hear that Auckland Transport is pursuing that. So I just wanted to really raise this as an issue, because it's also going to have an impact on our budgets around having to keep replacing our assets that are getting damaged. It's going to put people off coming into the city centre if they're feeling they're not safe in our shared spaces that now have this beautiful lighting. So I really, really want to, I'm glad that we've got the C in there, that we're requesting Auckland Transport to optimise those revenue opportunities. And I'm sure it goes beyond parking, but I just really needed to take this opportunity to focus on this issue around the parking enforcement, because every single day I'm getting tagged into complaints, as is Councillor Hills and other councillors. And we just shouldn't, we've got to get it sorted. That is not the best way that we can be dealing with Auckland Transport, is this constant beat up on Twitter. So I just felt I needed to raise that today, so that the public know that we're really concerned about the issue. We can see how it's having an impact on our revenue, and that we've got a joined up approach to dealing with that. Also just wanted to support in terms of optimising revenue, what Mark said about we've really got to relook at park and rides. And those councillors who are great champions for climate action seem to have a blind spot when it comes to looking at the evidence around park and rides, and how we just cannot give away valuable resources for free that undermine our whole response, that discourages people using public transport, that don't optimise the assets that we have, let those who need to drive get into park and rides. And as I've often said, this has a particular impact on women who need to arrive later at park and rides, who might have different trip needs, and it really undermines our what we're trying to do with reducing our climate emissions. So I know that that's a conversation for when we're sort of normal. We're in a very volatile time at the moment. We're still dealing with the pandemic, but I just think the planning has to get underway now, so that when we see people coming back commuting, that we use the park and rides in a way. We use demand responsive pricing, so that is in place so that it's actually helping those drivers that need to park, need to get there early or later, that can get access into the park and rides, but we're also then getting the revenue from that really valuable resource that we've all invested in. So I did just want to kia kaha Mark and Auckland Transport for your work around that issue. I know it's very emotive, but if we just take an evidence-based approach to looking at that issue, and I hope all councillors will be open to that evidence, the surveying work that you've already done, that we can come up with a solution that everyone can see that this is a win-win for drivers, for PT, and for the whole community. So I just would like to see that happening. So I hope, Deputy Mayor, you're happy that I have asked that. I have made my comments in a way that is emphasising that this is a discussion about AT's budget, and this is about supporting that 50 million. The whole, I totally appreciate that it's been a very difficult time and there's a lot of moving parts. So I just wanted to add my support for AT, not only minimising costs, but also maximising and optimising the revenue opportunities that we have available that we haven't confronted up to this point, but this is the time to do it. So thank you, Madam Chair, for that opportunity to speak in support. Kia ora.
Thank you, Councillor. And I think the last comment I have is in the name of Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Chair. And I first just want to clarify, and I know it doesn't matter, but it's not ghost buses, it's ghost passengers. Ghost buses is when the buses don't turn up. If there's no passengers, they're ghost passengers because the buses are not ghosts. But I've heard it, lots of people say it over the last couple of months, and it's just a random thing. Sorry, you can probably hear Theo. It always happens when I turn my mute button off. I'm very disappointed that we have to provide this additional funding to Auckland Transport, and it's not because I don't think they need it. It's because I believe that the government should have, and I'm hoping they still will, should have provided this income for us. It's not anyone's fault. It's not the government's fault. It's not anyone's fault that we're in this situation. But if you think of what has been divvied out as support for business and for the region and for people, individuals during this outbreak, I think this makes up less than, or it's about 0.5% or just under 1% of the overall budget the government has had to put out for this outbreak. So I believe that we have shouldered a lot of this outbreak as a city, but also as an organisation. And I believe and I hope that the government will provide that income that we need. And I do want to thank Auckland Transport for still providing these services, because all those bus drivers were putting themselves at risk throughout the outbreak and still are. Those services, those buses that had ghost passengers, actually, I did see a lot of passengers on those buses during lockdown, often in nurses' uniforms, often in fluoros going to work. There was a lot of people who need those buses, older people, people with disabilities, young people, those who don't have cars, and those buses and ferries stayed going the whole time. And made sure people had access to food and healthcare. I know I was helping people figure out their routes to testing stations during that time. Those buses were lifesavers for many people. So just want to say, although that income is significant, it's fantastic that we had those buses, even though they weren't full, and they still aren't because people are afraid, that kept going. So thank you so much to Auckland Transport and all the drivers and everyone who was doing that mahi throughout lockdown, while many of us obviously had to stay home. So secondly, I just want to say I hope that they continue and will keep growing. And I think part of the PR and part of the mix needs to be 170 locations popped up on our buses and ferries, and not one driver or passenger caught COVID from those journeys. So I think it's important that's part of the message, that we tell people that, as far as we know, the evidence says that transmission on our buses is very, very unlikely, and hopefully people come back to PT. But people will not come back to PT. I've had a lot of complaints already, people going back to work if they're not frequent enough. So there is a tipping point in there somewhere. People will not come back to public transport if their bus used to be every 15 minutes, but now it's every hour. They're not going to go to the ferries if they're all at different times. So I understand why the buses are empty, because we're trying to make sure people know that those services are available. Otherwise, they won't come back. So there is a tipping point where we are going to spend some money, and what to the public looks like wasted money. But if we don't get people back to PT by showing them it's an attractive option which they can rely on like they used to, we won't ever get those people back. So yes, we do have to spend a bit of money to get people back on public transport, but it will happen in time, and it's happened overseas, and we just have to make sure that people know that it's fairly safe to do so, and we'll continue those distancing and masking rules as much as possible. Want to back up Pippa's comment. We do get tagged every day, and we get abused every day around the parking, and I do understand people's reluctance of maybe ticketing people in timed or paid parking areas, but when people are parked in illegal areas where you're not supposed to park at all, such as right in the front of shops, on shared spaces, up against the seating and crushing new plants and trees that the ratepayers have spent thousands or millions on in some situations, I think that's unacceptable, and we do have to find a way through that. And as Councillor Coombs says, it will help increase our PT revenue, our parking revenue, and in short term, it will have that increase in revenue on writing those tickets. If there is an issue with safety, I know Federal and a few other streets, they have automatic ticketing with the cameras. If you park illegally on the footpaths or in the areas there are stationary cameras which find people, so then you do reduce the risk to our parking enforcement officers, who are doing a fantastic and difficult job out there. But I know that the city centre, it is dangerous in a lot of those shared spaces now, because I've seen it. The other day I was in town and there was 20 or 30 cars parked where you would normally walk, so everyone's walking in the middle where the cars are going, and then you're stuck between trucks and other things. So although it's a strategy issue and an operational issue, it's definitely a revenue issue as well. But I just want to thank Auckland Transport again. Definitely support this, because we do not have another choice, but I do hope the government's going to come on board ASAP and give us that support too. But we are going to have to continue to fund these services at a loss until we get people back on them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Sandra, could you please reorder the C, make C A, B, and then A, C. Not that it's important, but look, in closing comments, I just want to thank Auckland Transport very much. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, finding your own cost savings. I want to thank you for the work you're doing alongside the Mayor and others on talking to central government about their assistance. Gosh, if we knew back then when we set the budget for the recovery budget, we knew then what we know now, it would look very different, which is why I've still got some concerns around our annual budget coming up. But I want to thank you for the work that you're doing, trying to make us the giver of last resort, for want of a better word, the funder of last resort. So to that end, it's been moved and seconded, and I will now take it to the vote.
Sorry, Madam Chair, can we just check? So the request, the approve the funding that is currently B, that becomes C, is that correct?
That's the last one, yep, sorry.
Thanks, Kalinda, thank you.
Yep, sorry, yeah. Just make sure you try to do everything else. And it was up to, I just want to make it very clear, Mark, are you listening? Up to?
Very clear.
Yeah, thank you. Keep smiling and carry on, keep calm and carry on. Okay, sorry, I'm back to the vote. It's been moved and seconded. I will take it on the voices. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried unanimously. Thank you.